I can honestly say I'm happier now than I've ever been in my life. I have a job I love, and a home I love, my family around. I'm happy. I never thought I could be happy again. I think that's perhaps a bigger miracle than even getting healed. Well, my father was Tom Rees, who was a very well-known evangelist, and my mother was Jean Rees, who was a very well-known writer. And so I suppose I grew up with a couple of spiritual superstars in a way, which was wonderful in one way, but in another way it was quite difficult, because my father always used to say, it really would help me if you were very, very good. And that's a hard thing to grow up with, really. After the war, they wanted to start this place for people who'd been broken by the war. They had lost their faith, perhaps. And so they bought this huge, great, derelict mansion in 32 acres of gardens. It was a beautiful house, but at first it was a terrifying place to live because there were mice and there were great toadstools and things growing out of the walls, and I could never find where my parents were. We had 200 people staying in our house every week, and they always wanted to take photographs of me and my brother, so we used to dodge away behind the bushes. We were terribly proud of our parents, but they were quite distant and busy people. We didn't see a great deal of them. Everybody called my father the boss, which made me feel that he was rather more a boss than a father. I was never allowed to go and see him. He had traffic lights outside his study door, and you knocked, and if he was very busy, a red light went on. And if it was all right, you could go in, there was a green light. And I for years thought that's the way it was with God, that when you prayed, most times he was going to be far too busy to listen. It took me years to get over that. My mother wanted to be much more accessible than that, but I couldn't always find her when I needed her. Of course, there are enormous advantages in having parents who are Christians, because they don't have to tell you you ought to read the Bible. You just watch them doing it. The best bit of every day was going into my mother's bed first thing in the morning. And she was always sitting up in bed with a tray of tea on her knee and this Bible just propped up here. That sort of taught me that the most important thing you can ever do is to have a relationship with God. And that was wonderful. And my father would walk up and down for 3 hours if he was going to preach for an hour and pray every word in. That kind of thing, you have to see it to learn it, really. I think what you learn as a child, particularly through watching your parents, stands you in such good stead later on in life, because some horrible things have happened to me, and yet I've had that to fall back on. I went to school happily, thinking that I would be like everyone else, but it wasn't very long before I realised I wasn't like the other children at all, because they could all recognise numbers and letters and write their name, and they read, but I couldn't. And I would sit down to write, and wonderful story would flow out, and then the teacher wouldn't be able to read it. She'd just write gibberish in red pen right across it. And nowadays it would have been diagnosed as dyslexia, but in those days you were just labelled thick. I had one particular teacher. She used to shout and got all the other girls to laugh at me. She was actually sadistic. I think perhaps there was something in her past which made her hate me for some reason. But looking back now, I can actually see that it was hell. Nightmares for years afterwards. Yeah. I think as I became an adult, I probably realised that the treatment I'd had at school had a profound effect on me, because I ran away at the age of 11, and so I never had any bits of paper or exam passes or anything. And I think the things that the teacher said to me, "You're the stupidest child I've ever had the misfortune to teach," that sticks very deep. So you see yourself as a stupid child. And I also saw myself as a disappointment to my parents, because I couldn't be the person I know my mother particularly wanted me to be. And I think it had an enormous effect on me as I grew up. And what I did, and what many children do, is completely forget. It's as if they delete the whole video. So I couldn't even remember anything about being at school. Till one day I heard a sermon, and the man said, "Is there anybody in your life that you need to forgive?" And I thought, well, no, because I'm happily married, everything's going well for me. But then I just prayed this very unwise little prayer to God, which was, "If there is anybody I need to forgive, will you show me?" And straight away into my head came a voice, a harsh voice, shouting. And I knew who it was. It was this teacher. And it took me months of working on this to realise that I needed to forgive her for all that she'd done. So I decided that I would go to her and see her personally, and I took a huge great bunch of flowers, because I thought that would be my way of giving her my forgiveness without her realising what I was doing. I think she was pleased with them. And just as we were going, she said, "I think perhaps in our day we didn't understand dyslexia, and we perhaps were rather cruel," which was an amazing thing for her to say. And I took that as her saying, "Look, I'm sorry." And I just held her hand. I actually kissed her. It was amazing. Never in my worst dream could I imagine doing such a thing. But it was so natural to do it. I just said, "It's all right, I understand." And that was such a healing thing for me. Because I was a very lonely child, my brother was off at boarding school quite young, my great comfort was eating. I just ate and ate and ate, and I got enormously fat. There's nothing so awful as to let a child or a teenager be fat, because it destroys them like no other disability. And you laugh and you're the big clown and ha ha, I don't mind. Inside you mind intensely. I then went totally the other way into anorexia, quite a dangerous degree of anorexia, late teens and early 20s. And I think what cured me really was marrying my husband. But one of the major helps for me was the encounter I had with that school teacher. A lot of the things that I'd been holding against her, deep down, not realising I was having that effect on me. And when I went to her and had that experience of giving and receiving forgiveness, after that it was an awful lot better. But God helps. He absolutely does help. When we first moved to that great big old house, and I was so afraid, I think I became extremely difficult. I said to my mum, "Why do we have to live in a great big house with 200 people all the time? Why do we have to live there?" And she said, "But we want to tell them about Jesus, and some of them are really very sad, and we help them to ask him to come into their hearts, and then he makes them happier." And I turned around and I said, "Well, if I did that, would he make me happier?" And she said, "Yes, he would. Why don't you do it?" And so she helped me to say a very simple prayer. "Come into my heart, Lord Jesus. Come in today. Come in to stay. Come into my heart, Lord Jesus." Now, that happened, and it was extraordinary. Everyone, including my embarrassed nanny, but my grandparents, uncles and aunts, as well as my parents, have always told me the story of how totally I changed from that moment. It made a difference to have God inside. A few years later, I'd probably be about 7, sitting in my mother's bed one morning, and she was reading from Hosea chapter 6. "Listen to this, Jen," she said. She read out this verse. "Then shall they know when they follow on to know the Lord." I could see she had that. and I wanted it. I wanted it with a passionate intensity. And I remember going out later on that day and sitting on an old tree stump, which was my sort of den place, and sat there, and I said to God, that's what I want. When I grow up, all I want is to really know you. I think it's difficult to really know God, because really to have that deep relationship with him, he longs for you to put him first. And putting God first in your life just isn't easy, because other things come in, other relationships, even your children and your husband, good relationships. I'm not saying God doesn't want you to have those, because of course he does, but they can become more important to you than he is. And then he knows, of course, that you're in great danger. And there have been times in my life when other things have become more important to me than him. Even my husband, he became like my God that I worshipped, to the exclusion, I think, of God and serving God. But when you can hold them on an open hand, somehow he gives them to you in a safer way, because you've got him first. Well, the way I met my husband was rather funny, really. My brother was starting a little group with guitars, and there was one young man in the group I loathed. And then all of a sudden, quite suddenly one day, we fell in love. We got married, and we went to live in an idyllic little village, with a village green, and my husband was a teacher. I didn't think it was possible to be as happy as that. We bred like rabbits. We had baby after baby after baby. We had 5 of our own, and then we adopted another friend's child when her parents died, and we had loads of foster children, sometimes 10 in the house at once. It was lovely. I loved every minute of it. One of the children we fostered was with us for about 10 years, and she came when both her parents had died. But when she was 18, she ran away from home and went to London, where she completely disappeared. We didn't even have an address to send her a Christmas card, which I found very sad. And one night, when she was totally down on her luck, walking through the streets of London, she prayed a little prayer, "Oh God, if you do love me, like Mum always said you did, show me." And almost straight away, 2 girls stepped out of the underground and said, "We felt God was telling us to tell you he loves you." They took her home and gave her a meal and a bed for the night, and later on took her to their church, where she was baptised and met her lovely husband. She's gone on with her faith ever since, and so has her husband. They're a delight. Everything changed almost overnight. One day I was just whisked away in an ambulance. I couldn't breathe, swallow, speak, see, move. Terrifying. It was actually a brain virus, similar to meningitis, but actually more serious because it was inflammation of the actual brain. I wanted to talk to my husband about the things that really mattered. I wanted to say, be sure that you don't do peanut sandwiches for Sarah Jane, because she can't abide it, and watch out, no Marmite for Naomi. And it's a stupid thing like that. But I went to sleep in the middle of saying it, and when I woke up, he was gone. Well, he had to go and look after the children, you know. And I had a most extraordinary experience that night when I actually died. People talk about near-death experiences. I thought I was the only one that it ever happened to. I just floated out of the bed. My minister and his wife were praying for me at the time. I could hear his voice in the distance, but it grew fainter and fainter, and I just floated out of the room, really. It was like free falling from an aircraft, but it was going up. And it was beautiful, because I thought to myself, I'm going to see God. But I never did, quite. I knew that I was in a beautiful place and I was going towards him, I heard this voice saying, "Are you going to come in or do you want to go back? You can choose." And of course I didn't want to go back. Of course I didn't die into that pain and all. But I also thought about the children, and they were so little. The youngest was only 4 and the oldest 14. And I thought, well, if I've got to have a choice, then I better go back. But straight away I was back in the bed and the minister was still praying for me. The illness left me with all kinds of damage to the central nervous system. So when I finally came out of hospital, like months later, I couldn't really walk properly. I couldn't get words out. I couldn't see properly. I couldn't balance. I fell over. And when you've got 6 children and you can't look after them, that was very, very tough. The DSS were wonderful. They couldn't have done more for us. They gave me a wheelchair, put me a lift in, rails. I had a lovely home help. They didn't even bother to assess me for the benefits after a while. They just said, this patient is unlikely to recover. I just thought, well, I'm a number in a DSS file for good now. That's me. I'm dumped. Felt bad. As a Christian, it was really quite difficult because we knew that God healed. People in our church had got healed, and people in our church were very ready to pray for us and for me, and yet God didn't seem to answer. So people took me off to different healing services and different people with a healing ministry, and of course you know there's nothing wrong with the people who's praying for you, and so you think to yourself, well, I haven't got enough faith. I've failed in some way. There must be something about me that's defective. So I really struggled with that. I very nearly lost my faith in God altogether at that point. And I came to realise that it doesn't really matter if you're well or if you're not. I remember once feeling that God said to me, well, if I'd called you to do a very difficult thing for me, like go and be a missionary or something, you'd have done it, wouldn't you? But I've called you to do nothing but sit in that wheelchair. Will you do that? Will you do nothing for me as willingly as you do something difficult? So I came to the point of saying, yes, I would. And if you want me to be like this, then you can heal me when you're ready. But in the meantime, I'm going to get on and enjoy my life as much as I can and hopefully make it useful. So that's when I began to write. And I wrote this book called Beyond Healing, because not everybody does get better. And I think we have to face that. I'm sure it must be God's will always to heal us, and one day He will heal us in heaven. But for some reason down here on earth, He doesn't always heal people. And that doesn't mean they haven't got enough faith. So I wanted to write about that in the book. And it became a bestseller because I think so many people were quite relieved at that time in the history of healing to hear that. I think after those times when God met me, I think He gave me a kind of gift of peace and inner contentment. We called it, as a family, we called it peace joy, put the two things together. And that had a profound effect on the children and on my husband, because they'd been very insecure. Probably because I was so insecure, but because I was upset and trying to find healing and why wasn't I healed, that kind of thing. But once I'd settled, they settled. And we moved from the country into Tunbridge Wells. And I think we then had 6 very happy years. The children liked having a mother who was always at home and always there, ready to watch neighbours. And one day I had this strange experience that God was saying to me, I want to heal you. And I wasn't really sure that it was God, because frankly I'd gone through all that. I didn't want to go back into that uncertainty of getting my hopes up and then dashed again. So I took no notice. For 24 hours I struggled. It kept coming. I want to heal you. I suddenly felt, right, well, I'm going to write a prayer to God in my Bible. If that is you, and you really do want to heal me, then would you send someone right out of the blue to tell me you want to heal me, and then I'll know. And I think that he said to me, you must be quiet about it. But I've got the prayer written out here. It's like a sort of stone of remembrance for me, really, that it's there. I expected it to happen, and it didn't for 3 months, until I went off to speak at a meeting, a ladies' meeting, and suddenly, just in the front row, a young girl interrupted what I was saying and asked a question and said, I feel that God's telling me to tell you he wants to heal you. Inside, I just knew that the moment had come. I asked her to pray for me, which she very nervously did because she'd never prayed out loud before. And she prayed a very short prayer, but I knew I was healed. So I got out of my wheelchair, and I've never sat in a wheelchair since. My minister's wife had taken me to that meeting, and another friend, and we drove all the way home in total silence. I think I was stunned. I was so happy I couldn't contain it, and I knew that it had happened. And I carried the wheelchair into the house. But I think it was quite difficult for the family at first. They'd been so used to looking after me, so used to having to do everything, and suddenly I wanted to do things. It was my son, youngest son, who'd been only 4 when I was first ill. He could not get used to a mother who ran around. He said, I don't know who you are. They all took a long time to adjust. My husband was very wary at first. He said later that actually he felt he couldn't bear it if he got excited and then I got ill again. Couldn't let himself be happy. So for about 10 days, he hardly spoke to me. He spent all his time up at the allotment digging, furiously digging. And then one day I went out for a Sunday afternoon walk and I leapt over a gate and ran up a hill, just literally to show off I could do it. And he came up behind me and his eyes were just full of light and he said, we have a future together. He felt that we lost the future, the hope of my health of ever coming back. I think we fell in love all over again. It was a very special time. I went to my own GP the following day. She was lovely. He said he'd never seen anything like this happen to anyone. He was utterly supportive and kind in every way. Never ever have I had a recurrence of that again. One of the funniest things that happened just after I was healed was that I'd already said yes to a speaking engagement to go and speak to a group of ladies on how a mother in a wheelchair copes and holds on to her faith even when God doesn't answer the prayers. And I went very apologetically to this meeting and I said, I'm most terribly sorry, but I'm afraid the talk's a bit ruined, but I'm not in a wheelchair anymore. And then I suddenly realised that these women were listening like I'd never, ever been listened to before. As I talked to them about finding peace inside and knowing God was actually the greatest thing that you can ever find, they listened to that much more attentively because I'd been healed. And I thought, well, if I could talk to people about healing, which they'll come and listen to, but actually to say to them the greatest healing is inside healing, knowing God as a friend, I thought this would be wonderful. I should love to do this. And I think my husband felt the same. He just said, well, God's given us so much, we need to give back to other people. And so he gave up his very, very good job in education. He was a schools inspector. But he said, no, it's more important that we tell people that there is someone up there who can intervene, does intervene, and changes things. So we started to work for a trust, going around speaking. We didn't speak that much about healing, to be quite honest, because we knew how hard it is when people talk about healing and you're not healed, and God doesn't heal everyone. So we just said that if God can do this, on the outside healing, he can do wonderful things on the inside. And finding that peace in the difficult things is a greater miracle. And so then we started to run little holidays for people who were coming to terms with disabilities and also bereavement, that kind of thing. And soon we were running about 12 of them a year, some abroad, some in this country. It was great fun working together. We really loved it. And then we came to the feeling that there were so many people needing to come and just talk one-to-one, and maybe to stay a little while. And we found this place. We found it, strangely, through a picture that came in my head when we were praying. I saw a picture of a little courtyard with a fountain and a room, a door beyond. And in the picture there were crowds of people coming in a long line, coming through the courtyard and through the door. And I shared that with Tony, and he was vastly excited about it. And so we found this bungalow. He built the courtyard and the fountain and this room with a door. And that picture's come true, really. People come here all the time. I absolutely loved working with Tony. He had such a gift with people who were broken. He was so kind and so caring. Tony's mother came to live with us after she'd had a stroke, and that was quite difficult in one way because it meant that we couldn't go together. One of us stayed home with her and the other one went to run the conferences or speak. And then all of a sudden, into the blue, another bombshell. I got a cancer scare, which meant that I couldn't go, after some treatment, I couldn't go to run one of our holidays with Tony. And it was while he was running that on his own that he met somebody who'd been broken by a marriage breakup and began to help her. And they fell in love. And just after our 30th wedding anniversary, he just drove away down the drive. I had one great big son, great big chunky rugby player, and he came out with me. And he just sat and wept like a baby, because his dad had gone. I just wanted to die. I absolutely loved working with Tony. He was very much my boss, but we found that we were a perfect partnership, really, because what I couldn't do, he was good at, and worked the other way. I didn't think it was possible to be as happy as that. He met somebody who'd been broken by a marriage breakup and began to help her, and they fell in love. A man will minister to a woman and a bond develops, and it is actually quite dangerous. It was terrible because we'd been best friends, we'd been so close for 30 years, and suddenly it was as if we were drifting apart into two separate bubbles. I think over the next 18 months, his faith really was in crisis, and it was very hard for him. We tried to go away on holiday together, thought that might help. So I thought, if you go on loving and forgiving and making it easy, it'll come right. And it didn't. I thought he wasn't seeing her anymore, but actually he was. The day that Tony left, he said, "She needs me more than you do, because you've got Jesus to look after you." I think she was probably saying she couldn't live without him. I didn't think I could either. And just after our 30th wedding anniversary, he just put all his possessions into 4 black polythene sacks and he drove away down the drive. I think for the first few weeks after he'd gone, I went around like a zombie. I just cleared up the attic and cleaned obsessively. He'd also left his elderly, frail mum behind. Made it difficult. At first, I totally blamed myself. You just think, well, I should have done something differently. If I had highlighted my hair, I had a facelift. And I think a sort of awful spiral of remorse and if onlys came over me. Everything was my fault. It's always difficult when a marriage breaks up, but when you're living in the public eye because you've written books and because you've got a ministry, I think it's even more difficult. I'm terribly sorry for vicars and ministers when this happens to them, because everybody feels they have the right to tell you why they think your marriage went wrong. And I had quantities of letters saying the most awfully difficult things. One lady wrote and said, "How was your sex life?" And somebody else said, "I hope that you're doing a lot of repenting." Actually, she was right, and I knew she was right, and I was struggling with that at the time. When a marriage breaks, it is a bereavement. And you go through all the stages that somebody would go through who'd been bereaved through death. You go through the fear, the panic attacks, the loss of confidence, the worries. You go through the questions. Why did this happen to me? And you go through the wanting to hide every time the doorbell goes. But somehow the funeral marks an end. But you don't have that end when someone's left you, because you hope they're going to come back. And the depression. I think it is a normal part of coming to terms with anything major and frightful, is depression. But it's hard for Christians because you think you ought to trust the Lord and always be joyful. And depression actually is a physical reaction to what you've gone through. I think at the back of my mind, all along, I always thought Tony would come back. And once I was sitting with a client, talking away to a client, and it was beginning to get dark, and I saw Tony walking across the garden. I was so excited. I dashed to the front door, arms open wide, flung the door open, and he was the Conservative candidate. I think it's possibly the cruelest thing that any parent can ever do to their children is to leave. And no amount of unhappiness in the marriage is worth splitting, because it does something to your children, a damage that hurts them for the rest of their lives. I had one great big son, great big chunky rugby player, and he just sat and wept like a baby because his dad had gone. It's what it does to the children. And what do the ones who are married, what do they say to their children? You know, Grandpa doesn't love Granny anymore, so he's gone. Well, what does that teach them about marriage and loving and staying together? You don't want to see your children and your grandchildren grieving like that. I think 10 years on, it's still having an effect on all my children. Devastating on some. I mean, if he'd been a horrible father, maybe they'd have been glad to have got rid of him. But he wasn't. He was a wonderful father to them. Tony was an incredibly efficient person, and he always did everything. I'd never even needed one of those plastic cards, so I was so helpless. One of my children came back from university and explained about what you do, and you put the card in the wall and how money comes out. I thought it was a great idea until no money came out one day. That was bad. There were things like the bills, and because I have dyslexia, I can't do forms because you make spelling mistakes and you can't write properly. And forms have always terrified me. And all these forms and bills kept coming. But then I couldn't do it and I would panic. I didn't know what I was going to do with life, really, the rest of my life. Tony said I would have to sell the house and get a job. It was very difficult because we'd worked together in ministry. And without him, I didn't have a ministry anymore. I didn't think that the people who supported us and prayed for us would want to go on supporting just me. And anyway, I didn't think anyone would ever ask me to go and speak at a meeting or write a book again, because I felt I'd got this word failure written over my forehead, because I hadn't managed to hold on to the one most important relationship of all. And one awful night, the loo was leaking. It was raining, so the roof was leaking, and there was a mouse in my wardrobe. So I lay on the sofa with a duvet over my head. I just wanted to die. Because it's a lonely feeling when you've just got nobody who's there for you. That morning, a friend had sent me a card in a letter, and it just said, take a look at Isaiah 54. I was so cross because the last thing I could do at a time like that was to look at a whole long chapter. I just used to sit and hold the Bible. That's all I could do. I thought, well, I've got nothing else to do, so I crept out, got my glasses on, and I read Isaiah 54. Fear not. You shall not be ashamed, neither confounded and depressed. Well, I jolly well was, for your Maker is your husband.
If you trust me in all things, then your sorrow shall take wings.
I thought about God as a father and a friend and a boss, but I never thought about him as a husband before. I thought of what a perfect husband is. I mean, Tony hadn't been perfect, but by God, he was very near. And I thought, well, God's saying he's going to be my husband, and he really would be a perfect husband. And in the days when that was written, a husband provided everything for a wife. She didn't go out to work, and she depended on him for her happiness and for her status in life and for all her provision. And I thought, God is saying to me, he'll be my husband. And I thought, no, that couldn't be right, really, because that perhaps applies to the Jews, Old Testament, maybe. And then I thought, in the New Testament, it talks a lot about Jesus being our bridegroom. So maybe that is what God is saying, he'd be my husband. And if he's my husband, then he's going to look after me in all the practical things of life. Everything. It doesn't really matter if the roof leaks or you can't pay the bills. What really matters is if there's somebody there who really loves you and puts you first and is there for you. And I thought, well, I've actually got nothing to lose here. I'm going to risk it and go for it. And I remember the moment when I just made that choice. I thought, I'm going to trust him. I had to go on to Prozac and all sorts of things. But underlying all the difficulties since, actually God has provided for me, and he has met that need for love and being accepted and being valued for yourself. God's met that over and over and over again, because the first thing was, of course, that I couldn't pay the mortgage. I'd have to leave the house. And then just through the post one day came a letter and a cheque, and it paid off the mortgage. Tony's brother was wonderfully kind and helped to pay the expenses, really, and other people clubbed together and helped me. Next weekend, 2 of my children came home from university, climbed onto the roof, never leaked since. All those bills and things, I somehow managed to pay them. Quite a miracle, which I still to this day don't understand, but the money was there. And I don't know what happened to the mouse. And one day, I was sorting through the post, and I had this brown envelope, and it was from a solicitor. Tony wanted to get married again. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. Literally felt as if I was punched in the chest. It wasn't so much the horror of the divorce. I felt God had let me down. All that prayer, I thought I'd wasted my time. I think for me it really was the last straw, because I just had a whole series, within 6 months, a whole series of horrendous things. That had a little granddaughter died, had my 2 very best friends, prayer partners, die, even though I'd prayed for them. 2 of my children had emigrated. It was awful. It was a very scary feeling. So I think I went down into a frightful spiral. I could feel these doubts just coming up. And I was going down and down and down and down and down. And actually, when you've loved God all your life, and you've sat on a tree stump and said the only thing you ever want to do is to know him, and suddenly you feel he isn't there anymore, I tell you, that's a worse bereavement than losing a human being. And I went to my counsellor, who was a great help, Christian counsellor, and I said to her, I think I'm very depressed. No, she said, I don't think you're depressed, I think you're angry. And I was really quite angry with her for saying I was angry. I said, I'm not angry. I can't feel any anger. As a child, I'd been taught by my parents that as our family, we didn't get angry, and anger was wrong. So I buried it down, put this smile on my face and hid the anger. I'd got it so well under control that I didn't even feel it was there. And that's dangerous, because anger is an energy which has to be released, or it poisons your whole system. And so she made me write out a great list. And I thought, well, it's going to be a very short list. But when I started, the list got very, very long. It wasn't just what Tony and his now wife had done. It was what other people had said, all the letters that I'd had, and tactless remarks, and the things that people hadn't done, like they had just gone off and stopped being my friend and never said why. Those sort of things. And then she made me read it aloud to God. And at the end of it, she said, now what do you think God should do to those people? And everything in me wanted to say, annihilate them. You know, there's nothing in hell bad enough. And I had a most extraordinary picture of Jesus on the cross, going through a hell worse than anything, really, didn't he? And I thought, well, he went through that for me, but he also went through it for them. And if he's willing to forgive me for all the stuff that I've done wrong, then I must ask him to forgive these people, because actually he's already paid that horrible penalty, so they wouldn't have to. And it was a very special moment, very. She helped me to ask God to forgive me for holding so much anger. The one thing I think I've learned through what's happened to me is that forgiveness is humanly impossible. And people are almost forced into trying it humanly, and then you feel a total failure. You can't do it when you've really been badly hurt. You have to turn to Jesus and say, I can't do this. Will you come in and forgive through me? And I think that's the secret, realising you can't, but all he wants is for you to ask him to do it through you, and then you can. The other thing that really helped me was the buttons. My granny's buttons. For months after Tony had gone, I used to not know how to pray for him, but I had this little cross, and I chose out of all my granny's buttons 2 buttons, one that sort of reminded me of Tony and one reminded me of his wife. And I used to hold them in my hands, because Jesus says, pray for the people who treat you badly. But what do you say? When you want to say, oh, punish them, Lord. But that's not what he meant. He meant pray a blessing on them. But you don't want to do that. So I used to sit and hold the buttons and hold them out to him and say, look, I'm holding them out to you in your light, and I want you to know, you to do what you want to do with them, but I can't cope. And then I would put them down in front of the cross and I would leave them there, go about my business in the day. And then I'd be washing up and it would all come over me again. So I would rush back in, pick up the buttons, hold them out again and put them down. And I used to have to do that 10, 15 times a day at first. And then it just got down to once a day. Now I don't have to do it much. And that has been such a releasing thing to me. I often, when I'm listening to people who've got much worse things to forgive than I've ever had, they want to forgive, but they don't actually know how to. So I often say to them, well, let's get out Granny's buttons. No, why don't we just pray for him? One of the things that helped was I went for a long walk on a very, very dreary winter's day, muddy, wet. And it suddenly occurred to me that there isn't just God, but there's an enemy. And I realised that Satan had an agenda to destroy everything that I had and my faith, but also the Lord had an agenda. He hadn't caused all these horrid things, but since they'd happened, he wanted to use them actually to build my faith in him. I always thought of myself clinging to him like a koala bear baby, you know, in the trees. He wanted to make me cling more tightly, and he wanted to build my faith in him and to help me to forgive even deeper levels. He wanted to bless my children. He'd got loads of things he wanted to do that were good. And the enemy had loads of things he wanted to do that were bad. And it suddenly dawned on me that I wasn't a helpless pawn. I had the right to choose who got what they wanted. And I remember saying, I want you to win, Lord. Of course, I was wrong to think that God was powerless. He gave us a very special gift, right back in time, the gift of choice. And we can choose. And we live with the consequences of those choices. And I think even when somebody else chooses something which is awful, God is so powerful that he's able to come in and make it up to us in such a wonderful way that he gives us better things than we could ever have dreamed of.
Jesus taught us to forgive, to pray for those who have wounded our hearts, lift them up and give them to Father. By the same grace you are saved. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we also forgive. Lead us not into temptation, but free us from Satan's power.
I think there's 2 sides, 2 stages of forgiveness. There's where you forgive in your heart, and then there's where you reach out to another person, a more active part of it. I felt that it would be important that we would meet up, the 3 of us. For one thing, I didn't want there to be an embarrassment at children's weddings and funerals and christenings and things. I wanted us to be able to be friends. So in the end I asked them if they'd come over and have coffee with me one day. So they said they would. And as soon as I knew they were coming, I was terrified. I thought, what will I say? What will I do? And when the doorbell rang, I thought, I'm going to run away. I'm going to hide here. I can't do this. And I walked up the hall. Everything within me wanted to punch her, to be honest. And then I thought, no, I want to ask God to give me his love, his forgiving grace. And I opened the door and I saw how very vulnerable she looked. And it was so easy. Yeah, I just hugged her. And it wasn't just a put-on hug, it was an easy hug. And the funny thing is that since then, we've got quite close. I can feel very comfortable with her now. And I think that has to be God, really, to make that a possible thing. I know I had a shell around me. It wasn't a granite shell, it was a sort of like sugary, sweet, I've got to be good all the time shell. I think I'm much more of a real person than I ever was because of all that's happened to me. It's like the shell of your heart's broken and you're more open to God's love. You can receive more of his love and his comfort through the broken bits of your heart, really. And I think, too, you're able to give more love. It's not just that he's mended my broken heart, and he undoubtedly has, but I think he's used what I've gone through because people come here every day, literally every day. When you are going through a bad place, you go to somebody who understands from experience how awful it feels. And so God's used that, and it's the deepest encouragement to me to see the way God can mend them. I work with a lot of other people, a wonderful team, but all of us have gone through some kind of major loss ourselves. For instance, my friend Cupie spends a lot of time helping people to release their emotions through literally allowing their emotions to pour out onto paper, and that really releases people. You have to be listened to. I get lots of letters from people who've been really healed inside by God. They come just shattered wrecks like I felt, and I can see as they come regularly how God builds them up and mends them. And before I know where I am, I'm seeing them spending time with other people, doing the same, handing on the comfort that he gave to them through me, and I got from him. I can honestly say I'm happier now than I've ever been in my life. I have a job I love, and a home I love, my family around. I'm happy. I never thought I could be happy again because I absolutely adore Tony. I probably still do. But there is a place when you reach that acceptance place, when you know you can't have back what you wanted, but life can still be happy, but in a different way. And there's a peace when you come to accept that you can't always have what you want. I think that's perhaps a bigger miracle than even getting healed. God has to do that for you. I don't really believe you can get to that place without God. It is possible to be happy again, but it does take a long time. Looking back on my life, I'm even more than ever convinced that God heals. When I think of all the different ways that he's healed me as a person, he's healed the damage that dyslexia does to you. I've actually written 30 books, which I'm quite sure my school teacher would never have believed I could. He's healed the loneliness of being fat. Certainly healed my body after 8 years in a wheelchair. That has to be quite wonderful. But he heals broken hearts too. I've seen him mend my children. Although they were all sad, they've grown through it. And I've seen now him healing countless other people. So there's no way anybody could ever convince me that God doesn't heal.